Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Hey, what's crack-a-lackin'? This is CJ Gustafson back with another enthralling episode of the Run the Numbers podcast. I just got off the phone with Charly Kevers, the CFO of Carta. I look at myself as a fanboy of this company. I stuttered there because it feels weird to say out loud. It's like if software companies were boy bands, like Carta would be my like Backstreet Boys or NSYNC. I love this company because of the tools they make, just because I live inside of cap tables all day, and because they solve the problem for me. That's extremely relevant. So this was an interview that I had circled on the calendar. It's kind of like when you think about a football team, they're like, we're circling the Jets next week. I'm like, I'm circling Carta. And I got hyped up for this one. You can probably hear from the beginning, the excitement in my voice, also the heartburn in my chest. I had half a box of Eggo waffles before we went live and 4 coffees. We're going to get to that episode. Before we do, I want you to smash that like, subscribe, 5-star button. I heard one of the founders of Turpentine actually last week. You know who you are. Hadn't hit the button yet. So looking for a little bit of support here. Help a brother out. Hit the 5-star button. I love all you listeners. Thank you. All right. But before we get to the interview, I want to go off the books for a second because as we all know, it seems to be contract negotiation season. And so this is a story about my first time as, the person on the other side of the table actually negotiating these contracts. My first real negotiation as a CFO. At the end, I'm going to give you 3 takeaways, but I'll just tee it up for you. So, you don't really build many negotiation skills in the FP&A world. I mean, you're, brokering budgets, but you're not really going head to head with someone that you actually have to pay. And I didn't really have that skill, and I didn't really want it either. Unfortunately, I've come around to now, work on it reluctantly, but I will put my wife up against a used car dealer before I actually talk to them and haggle over price. It just makes me very uncomfortable asking for discounts and stuff. I don't know why. And so my first negotiation as a CFO was against a small company in San Francisco called Salesforce. When I went into the negotiation, I didn't have much ammunition to go off of. 1, I didn't have the skills, and then 2, I was declining to renew Tableau, which I didn't even know they owned. The second thing that I had to do was tell them that we didn't want Marketing Cloud, which they had auto-renewed the year before and we had paid for but not used. And the third thing, and this is where they really got me, is I tried to push back and be all slick. And this is where I feel like I had imposter syndrome and it actually backfired on me. I tried to act like I knew more than I did. It was a vulnerable moment where I actually got punched in the face. And what happened was I remember I told the rep, I was like, yeah, but I don't really think we need that. He's like, I don't know. I think you do, man. And he shares his screen, I remember. And it's you are 450% over in storage that we haven't charged you for. And we're going to be nice and not charge you for it. And also, you're 65 days behind in paying us for the last quarter. And I'm sitting there yeah, I know, but isn't there anything we can do about this? And I got my teeth kicked in. And so I took some things away from that. And the first thing is know where the power lies in negotiation. I knew that with Salesforce, I wasn't going to scare them into thinking I was going to go use spreadsheets or HubSpot tomorrow. The second thing was they knew I owed them money, unfortunately. But there are some levers that I've worked on since then. So the first thing is making the sales reps' life easier. And I actually got this from my brother who's in sales. And, it's to ask them, what could I do to make your life easier? When do you want me to sign by? And they'll be transparent with you. I mean, we're all people and we all have goals. These guys have quotas at the end of the month. And if you say, can you give me an extra 5% off if I promise you I'll sign by tomorrow? Usually you can get that. The second thing you can do is you have asymmetrical information how your company will grow over time. And so unfortunately at that time, I hadn't made an annual operating plan yet for the next year. I literally just walked through the door. But now I know how many heads are going to be in my operating plan for next year. And I can buy ahead of that growth to get a better discount. And the third thing I would say is study the payment terms. That's something that's also bit me in the ass before. If you're coming off of a round where you just raised money and you have some cash in the bank, do yourself a favor and use that to your advantage. Offer to prepay up front. Now you're probably getting a little bit of interest on it in the bank. You weren't before, but that's a tactic that I find works well. Like quarterly billing is great when you don't have a lot of money to spend, but if you can annual pay for it and also use that as a lever. Oh, and finally, I found out this cool thing where you can like let them use your logo and they can say, hey, these cool dudes over here are customer, you should be too. Apparently you get a discount for that. So all these different levers, things I didn't know then that I know now. I wouldn't say I'm like the Chris Voss FBI negotiator, never split the difference author yet, but I am working on it. And now it's like I got the fever. I've been bitten. I feel like I can negotiate for anything. I'll just go in and like try to negotiate for my daughter's childcare. I'll be like, daycare, $2,000 a month. How's $1,500 sound? She's a good kid, right? She's an act up. I'll negotiate for anything. And in fact, this weekend, this is where the plot thickens. I will go head to head with a used car salesman. Yes, my wife is going to be the lucky owner of either a luxury Toyota Highlander post 2021 or a Ford Edge. So, Gustafson family, stepping it up. I'll update you next week on this whole car saga. I hope my family will be the proud owner of one mid-tier sub-luxury SUV. It's got the seats in the back, so like we can throw my dog Walter back there. It's even got like an iPhone plug for him to charge his phone. So we're pretty pumped about that. I'll catch you next week on the Run the Numbers podcast. All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Run the Numbers podcast. I'm CJ Gustafson here with the CFO of Carta, Charly Kevers. Charly, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I was telling producer Nancy right before this that I'm extremely excited because I'm a Carta power user, but I also just had half a box of Eggo waffles with syrup right before this meeting because I couldn't find anything else in my home to eat for lunch. So I'm gonna try to bring the energy, but I'm really pumped to have you on.
That's good. And Eggo waffles with syrup, never a bad time to have that. So
I have a little bit of heartburn, so I'm managing that, but excited to have you here. Charly, I spent an inordinate amount of time in Carta, I have to admit. The scenario planning tool is amazing. We started out with just the basic cap table stuff, and when we found out that was something that was an option, and we were fundraising at the time, like we instantly upgraded. Like you couldn't take my money fast enough. It's so fascinating how you were able to go from what many people may think like a single product company with just cap table management to this multi-product, I'll say behemoth, but like one of my favorite finance tools in the past couple of years.
Well, always good to hear that it's helpful to a finance professional like you. And I'll encourage you to look at the expense accounting tool, which I personally like the best because that really saves a ton of time, and my team loves it.
And so, Charly, how many years have you been at Carta now?
Almost 6.5.
6.5. And when you started as CFO there, what would you say the number one thing was that kept you up at night?
It's not complicated. At that stage, it was cash.
Cash?
was the cash burn, and cash was all I was thinking about. So I joined between Series B and Series C. And actually, one of my first experiences with the CEO was to tell him that their planning was wrong and we were going to run out of cash a lot faster than he thought we would. And so we went to raise some cash a bit faster than was initially anticipated. And so cash was on my mind pretty much every day.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. If you're a startup founder or executive running a growing business, you know that as you scale, your systems break down and the cracks start to show. If this resonates with you, there are 3 numbers you need to know: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000. That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to Netsuite by Oracle. Netsuite is the #1 cloud financial system, streamlining accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. Netsuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. 1. Because your business is one of a kind, so you get a customized solution for all of your KPIs in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free at netsuite.com/metrics. That's netsuite.com/metrics to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/metrics. If you can just go back to that moment, how did you communicate it to him at the time? New CFO coming in, you inherited this book, and you're probably going through the balance sheet. What'd you say to him?
I just basically laid it out. Like, here's how I look at it. Here are all the expenses. Here's how much you pay people, and all the vendors that we have, and literally took him through the model and said, look, I just did it for myself to understand how the business was functioning in detail. And then, I mean, it was very clear, right? It wasn't very complicated, and looking at the hiring plan and these types of things. But with simple assumptions, you could tell, okay, we need more cash. And so he got it very quickly. I think the next week we were starting to put together a deck and worked on fundraising.
We were talking to Michael Tannenbaum on the podcast, who's Breck's CFO, and he made an analogy to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but with startups. And he said, instead of food and water and then shelter, at the beginning, it's like cash, cash, cash. Then after that, it's hiring. And I thought that was a really apt analogy of the way he described that startups go through these phases of needing different things and different things keeping you up at night.
100%. I can't agree more. Like, if you're not thinking, if you're in the early stage, you're not thinking about cash all the time as a finance person, you're not focused on the right thing. There's plenty of things operationally you need to be focused on as well. But in the end, your main job is to make sure the company doesn't run out of money. So pretty critical.
We touched on it at first, how you had to communicate a tough message to your CEO pretty early on in the job. I was doing some listening to podcasts you'd previously been on, and you'd called the CFO kind of a truth teller of sorts. Mm-hmm. How have you honed that skill of telling the truth in a balanced manner over your career without being an alarmist, but also, being the straight shooter?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is it's really working on communications and really being as transparent as you can. And your question is really apt in terms of, you don't want to freak out anybody, but it's really just about laying the facts as you see them. And you may be missing things, but at least enabling the discussion with your peers, the CEO, the board, and making sure that your job is to actually make that picture as clear as possible. And oftentimes, everybody doesn't have the ability to connect what's happening operationally to what's happening financially. And your job that's, to me, job number one is to help everybody make that connection. And so it just starts with that and really laying out, here's why I think, here's what's happening, and where I see an issue and things we want to work on. And so transparency and kind of ongoing engagement is really number one.
So I'm a first-time CFO. I'm going on my second year now. And I got to admit, something that I'm struggling with and looking for help on is how often to talk to my investors and communicate with them. And I think one of my flaws personality-wise is I can be a people pleaser when people ask things of me. Like I'll jump pretty quickly. How have you managed how often and like the cadence of talking to investors and telling them about the business, what's going right or wrong?
Yeah, we've actually iterated with that a lot ourselves as a team and myself. So in the early days, we were doing board meetings every 2 months, which frankly was
every 2 months, so not quarterly.
Every 2 months. We're doing quarterly now, but when we started, it was a lot more, which was helpful, but also meant a lot of work on my team to kind of every 2 months kind of get ready for that. We're now on a cadence where we've got monthly touch points that are scheduled and quarterly board meetings. That I've found to be like a really good mix in terms of our ability to update the board on things that are happening, never surprise them. And that schedule kind of touch point makes it easy to make sure most of them are on. And then personally, it's using those monthly touch points. And then frankly, anytime I have something to ask or an update to get them, or frankly, something's not going as well as we plan, I just pick up the phone and just call them. And so that's the main learning, is just call them. What I always tell my team is that the bad news should travel way faster than the good news, because that's how you build trust, and that's how you build enough of that reputation that the truth will come out of the finance team. And so same thing with the investors. And that's hard in the early days because you're never sure like what to say, what not to say.
Yeah.
But I found that many of them, they're all experienced investors. They've seen generally way worse things than whatever you're going to tell them is what I found out. And so they can take it. And generally it's better to have them in the loop. They can help you versus trying to do it all in the background. And sometimes it gets worse, and then they get surprised, and that's generally your worst position that puts you in.
It's kind of like it's never as good or as bad as it seems, probably.
100%. I've been in so many situations over my career where it helps you understand everything's relative. And so when it's your first time in the job, it feels terrible. And then investors, I remember actually one session with one of our Series B investors who did an offsite with my team. And I remember him starting the offsite by saying, I know you all think the wheels are coming off the bus, everything's broken, everything's on fire. It's like, that's normal. That means you're moving fast. That means the business is scaling. And everybody was like, yeah, how do you know? He's like, yep, that's totally normal. What you all think is just terrible, and you must be the only company faced with these challenges. Everybody is. And it was funny how just that one line made the whole team just relax a lot more and understand.
Kind of put you at ease.
And then it's just about picking what fires you put out, and just getting comfortable that certain things will get a little bit worse before you can get to them. But that's just the nature of the job in a fast scaling company.
I heard this quote last week, and it was, every startup is a loosely functioning disaster. And I think
That's
it's true to an extent. I mean, any company you think from the outside, like, wow, look at them, they're kicking ass, everything's up and to the right. And when you're in the moment, you're like, my goodness, this is a bumpier ride than I expected. And I wanted to ask, like, do you have any sort of framework of like how to know when it's time to pick up the phone and update somebody? Like, how do you know this is a big enough issue to update the board or even the CEO, I guess, internally on?
Yeah. I mean, my framework is generally, and it's really influenced by my days as an IR guy at a public company.
Yep.
It's when you set certain expectations and you know these expectations won't be met.
Won't be met. Okay.
Won't be, and it's just like the moment you know whatever. It doesn't have to be a metric, but just like, we're going to make progress on this. We're going to release this at this date, and you know you're going to be off those major milestones. Just pick up the phone and do it as fast as you can, even if it is to say, hey, I don't think we'll get there. I don't know yet when we will, but I'm working on it. That is better than just waiting to have the full answer. Readjust expectations as fast as you can.
And you were doing IR at HP. Do I have that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was a time where I think there were like 3 or 4 CEOs in a short period, right?
4 CEOs in 2 years. Yeah. So it was a really fun time.
Can you think of any examples of maybe a tough message you had to deliver?
A few. First, like, changing CEOs is never a good message to investors. We also did a disastrous acquisition. I remember, this is the only time in my career I got actually yelled at for a day straight by investors. Basically, were telling me, here's how much I've personally lost because of the thing that you did. The stock was down 30% in one day.
In one day, and from an acquisition?
Just absolutely crazily overpriced. It was a very challenging message to deliver, and I had to sit in front of everybody and say, no, this is great, it's going to make the company better. Right. And they're all like, no, this is terrible. And so that was not easy. And then relaying that back to the management team was also a fun thing to do, to tell them, by the way, the decision you just made, they could see the stock price, of course, but just had a lot of the actual quotes from our largest investors who were not very happy at the time.
There were some explicatives or swear words in there?
A lot of them. This was really my first experience to just like being the face of the company in those instances, right. And really taking it, say like, okay, thank you for your thoughts, and moving on.
How did you feel in the moment? Did you take it to heart?
I mean, this is where now with the retrospective, this is where now I'm like, nothing will ever be as bad as that day that I had, no matter what. And so, but yeah, at the time it's hard, like really trying to parse what they're trying to communicate. And a lot of it is just like, what I learned in those days is just uncertainty is the worst thing possible for investors. And so they just don't know. They don't understand enough. They don't have enough context to kind of get their heads around what does it mean for the business. And we had done, frankly, not a great job communicating that. And so to this day, I spend as much time as I can making sure that like I remove as much uncertainty as I can. It's never completely possible in the world of startups, but I see my job as partly trying to remove both internally and externally, but just how can I remove uncertainty and explain as much as I can in terms of what I see so that everybody's on the same playing field.
It's never as good or as bad as it seems, except for that day. It was as bad as it seemed.
That was. I'm hoping this is the worst it gets career-wise.
You always have that floor to build off of. And if you think about what makes a great CFO, what qualities or skills would you put on your list?
Yeah, it's probably obvious from everything I've mentioned. Communication is pretty high up the list. It's basic by being able to model, understand all the financials, that's table stakes. But I think really what sets apart great CFOs, and in my experience, like I've learned from a lot of really, really good CFOs, and they were tremendous communicators. And I'm trying to just be as careful as I can on that front. And it's both just what you deliver, but also how you present information. And I found just like spending enough time on, again, both internally and externally, how you explain what's happening to the business, how you break it down, just really making it as simple as possible so everybody can feel part of solving whatever problem you're trying to highlight is really critical. And that comes back to, can you communicate, in a written form, in presentation form, in verbal form, and that's a really critical piece of it. And there's not a lot of training around this, right? Like in the finance career, that is not like a critical piece of.
No one taught me how to write a good investor email. Like that was not in the handbook.
Yeah, and that's generally where you learn that on the job, and where people really stand out is their ability to just communicate really effectively. And with investors is the ability to relate a strategy in very compelling ways. So to them, it translates to like, okay, I understand what it means for the business and its financial profile in the future.
To get tactical, do you send a monthly email to investors that follows like a certain format? Is that how you usually get the message across? Like, hey, here are the key metrics. Like I call it a flash report, like at the end of the period. Do you discard to do one of those?
So I do a quarterly flash with all our key metrics on where we think the quarter and before we fully close the quarter, just to give them a quick sense of like, where are we on cash burn, where are we on AR growth, and all the components of AR. And on a monthly basis, more ad hoc, like if we have specific things we're kind of working on, we'll give them a quick update on that. But metrics wise, unless things are off track, it's more of a quarterly process at this point.
And the metrics that you talk to investors about, do you usually set those at the beginning of the year? And here's why I'm asking. I feel like sometimes coming into a role, finance people will almost try to blind investors and their bosses with science. They'll give them 10 metrics to look at. Like, are you pretty specific and thoughtful about, hey, these are the ones I'm just going to tell you about every single period over and over again?
Yeah, one thing I learned that from my days at public companies is having a very consistent set of slides that you communicate, or however you communicate to your board, that you show them consistently every quarter. So we've had the exact same views of our business, adjusted for the new things we've done, but generally following the same structure for, at this point, I think 4 years. And now it's really easy because like they have the trending, they know exactly what the slide means, they know exactly what the information is showing them. So we can actually focus on what's happening. What does this mean? This is not going as well as we thought. What are we doing about it? Versus like, what is this? Is this good? Is this bad? And so like that consistency is really key. And another piece to make sure you align with our investors on. So in the early days, I actually spent time with every single investor saying what's useful, what's not useful. Every new investor coming on board, spend time with them, asking, here's what we're looking at. Does that give you all the information you need to assess our performance? And over time, we got to a point where, like in our most recent fundraising, they were like, "Yep, your board decks are great. Gives us all the information. We don't need anything else." But that took a few years to really get to the right structure.
So if I'm hearing you right, you essentially train them on the structure and look of what they're going to see each period.
Yep.
And that probably goes a long way, in terms of creating it internally. Off the shelf what you have to create each period, and you're kind of training investors, I think, to a certain extent, because something that I have to always remind myself is that, like, hey, CJ, you're repeating yourself over and over again, but that's okay because they're probably involved in 10 other companies and they're not just thinking about your company every single day.
That's a discussion I have with my team all the time, because when they write certain things in board decks, and then if you work at the company, like, oh yeah, I know what this means. But if you take a step back, like, you're an investor, you have no clue what you just wrote on the slide, because it's so detailed and they haven't seen anything for 3 months. And so being really thoughtful, like, again, keeping it simple, tying it back to whatever you said last time. And so we always go What did we say in the last board deck? What are we saying now? Just making sure we're really thoughtful about this. Just make it as simple as possible for them to ingest the information.
What's some of the tactical advice that you usually give your team? Is it more is less? Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Yeah, every slide, one message, not 10. I personally am not a big fan of like a ton of numbers and then no highlight. Maybe there's no way to know what you should be looking at. So every one of our P&Ls, we actually highlight a few things we actually want them to pay attention to. Is it like a change in margin, a growth profile, something? But we rarely just show like, here's like, 100 numbers and
the Jackson Pollock slide. It's just paint on a page.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in just make it easy. And I personally believe in like make it visual. So, I mean, of course you can't avoid having detailed numbers on slides, but graphs tend to be ingested better. And so we spend a lot of time on like, what are the right views for what's going on with the business?
That makes a lot of sense. I've also worked with people who have very specific preferences. Like I worked with one guy who was so anti pie chart. Like you get visibly upset if you ever put a pie chart in one of his presentations. I don't know if you have a specific look and feel, but I remember when I first stepped into my CFO role for the first time, I was talking to, another mentor, and one of the things he said to me was like, get your look and feel, which sounds like crazy, but like your package together for internal and external delivery, because people will know, oh, this came from CJ. I can trust this information. And like I kind of sat back and thought about that. Like, so you think like the colors and like the look of the charts and like the headlines, like, I mean, that's just window dressing. He's like, no, that's your brand that people know this originated from you and they can trust it.
I agree. I mean, I am quite biased given I grew up as a consultant and an investment banker in the early parts of my career. That gets pounded into you that it has to look the same. Whatever comes out of the company or the bank or a consulting firm or the bank, this is our brand. This is how we make things look. And so same thing. I'm quite annoying with my team on just like we use consistent ways to show information. Here's how we label charts. But once you got it in a way that works that way, like, yeah, everybody knows, oh, this comes from the finance team. Like I know how to look at it. I know what the information means. It's much easier to get straight to the main topic you're trying to get to versus spending half your time explaining the charts.
I'm a recovering consultant as well. And people on like listening to this who weren't, they're probably like, these guys are nerding out on font sizes. But I remember a specific experience my second year in, and I had given my manager, Dasha, a chart that had different shade of green in it. And she said like, CJ, go and correct this. And I think I like said to her, like, it's green. Like, what's the difference? And she said, this is the only effing thing we sell. We don't have widgets. We don't produce anything else. We produce this content. And if I can't trust you with this, I can't trust you with anything else. And I was like, whoa, okay, I get it. This is what we're actually selling, this quality. And that kind of blew my mind at the time. So to transition a bit, I wanted to talk about working with a CEO. And so you've been at Carta since it was smaller size. Now it's, a brand name company. I'd say household brand, but not every household like mine talks about finance tools around the dinner table. So, but when you look back about your relationship with your CEO when you started, what's it like now with Henry? How has it evolved over time? Did you have that trust right off the bat? Like how has the dynamic changed?
I mean, obviously over 6.5 years and a lot of ups and downs, it changed a lot. Because now we know how to work with one another. We don't have to talk a whole lot. Like when he says like, I want to do this, I understand what he means and can quickly translate that into operationally what it means. And same thing when I bring something to him, he's like, okay, I see where you're coming from. I understand. That wasn't the case in the early days. I had to spend a lot of time explaining my perspective and breaking things down in different ways to kind of get alignment on how I thought the financials should evolve and should reflect what we're doing in the business. And similarly, he just, he's a founder, product-led founder. And so structure, process wasn't necessarily something that he liked to talk about. And growth was the biggest focus. And talk about gross margin. He was like, why do I need to care about gross margin? Now he knows that's changed dramatically. But it was, a lot of it was me aligning with him on what we were going to look at. What metrics really mattered, and that took a little bit of time for us to really align on these things.
Can we go to the gross margin thing? So was that something maybe you challenged him on once, or maybe had to bring him to the light of why it was important?
100%. I mean, I did it with him, and then I remember him saying, "You should explain this to everybody." And as a finance, like how do people not understand gross margin? But it was actually very, very powerful to do it for the whole company and
Yeah.
explaining, here's why I'm going to be annoying with all of you on unit economics and why that translates into gross margin, because that's what enables you to invest in growth and invest in R&D, and that's what feeds the business in longer term can make us a profitable company. Because if you're at 30% gross margin, it's very difficult to be profitable if you want to continue to invest in growth and innovation. And just that was actually also a great learning point for me, is don't ever be afraid to do it for the majority of the company, if not the whole company, because it's, even if they know it, it's a good reminder, and it aligns everybody on like, oh no, I understand why he talks about this all the time. Versus people are going to nod and say, yeah, okay, I've heard gross margin is important, but don't really know why. And so he's been really good at pushing me to say, go explain, like, why do you care about cash? Like, that's obvious, but like, why do you care about specific metrics around cash or collections and whatever it may be at different stages of the business?
Yeah.
Go explain to people why this matters. And so that's been a great learning, and collaborating with him around that has been great, because it also is important for him to be behind it. Because I can say something, and if he's like, yeah, that doesn't really matter, the rest of
Yeah.
the company won't care, obviously. So in the early days, it was really like learning from each other. And I think what helped me is not coming too hard on like, but this is what everybody else does. Like, this is how we should look at this, right? Really understanding how he was thinking about the business, how he was thinking about growth versus investments, and not say, this is what all the most successful public companies do.
What's the best way to walk that line? Because I'm such a benchmarking dork that like I always am like, well, here's a benchmark on why we should do it. But I think sometimes it falls flat, or it feels like I'm over clubbing like the situation just with numbers. How do you balance that when you talk to your CEO?
I think it starts with like making sure that you're aligned on like, what are you solving for, right?
Right.
Like, what are we trying to solve in the specific product area, the specific market, and then using that answer to say, okay, here are how some other companies do it, but for us, I think this is the right answer at this stage of growth. Because the challenge with comps, it's really, I mean, I'm with you, especially as an ex-banker, you can't help but think through, what does every other SaaS company do? What do other fintech companies do? And really trying to bring it back to that. And we use that in our planning processes, of course. But with him, it was really good to just say, here's why these few really specific examples are relevant to us. And we don't have to do the exact same thing, but I think it, here's how it informs how we think about it. And then, look at it through just the right metrics for the maturity stage. So for example, doing percentage of how much R&D you spend as a percentage of revenue in the early stages doesn't really help that much. To me, it was more like, how much growth do we want to add? How much are we investing to get that growth? So more of kind of these cash burn ratios or those types of things. And now we're at a stage where we can talk about rule of 40 and other things that are more typical for scale businesses. But I think the danger is to take metrics that are relevant for large businesses and apply them to a startup too quickly.
Have you seen that go wrong in your career?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I did it in the early days, and then probably shouldn't have pushed as hard on certain metrics. Like, look, we spend X amount of dollars of or X% of our revenue in sales and marketing. Like, that's too high. And the reality, like, this was the right thing to do at that stage for that business, because it was just so early, and capturing the market was the right thing to do. And so I think this is where you can be disconnected from what the business actually needs to do and where it is in its maturity cycle. And so it informs the analysis. I think I always warn people to not be too tied to kind of public comps, especially when you're like a $10 million business.
Yeah. What's your framework for making decisions? And I maybe to add some context to this question. So CFO is like one of the main jobs is to be, a steward of capital, make, good investment and capital allocation decisions. A lot of things come across your desk. How do you decide when to pull the trigger on your own versus when to ask Henry what his thoughts are?
So it's interesting for us, and it's been true from the early days, is that we actually have a discussion as part of every year when we set kind of what are the objectives for the year, and that's evolved quite a bit, but it was always a similar process. We're like, okay, what are we trying to solve this year? And from the beginning of the year, we actually made a decision on how much do we want to invest behind every bet we're making. So that made decisions a lot easier because as long as it fit within the investment envelope,
Like a dollar budget envelope, you're saying?
we would actually tie for each. So we managed the business from the early days in effectively business units. It's a little more complex than that, but think of it in a few different business units. And for each business unit, we give them a target of like, here's how much growth we want to drive from this business unit, and here's how many dollars we're willing to put behind driving that growth. And what was important is tying the growth to the investment. Meaning, if you don't get the growth that we're expecting of you, you're not going to get the full investment. We're going to pull back as the year progresses. That removed a lot of the everything having to come to me or Henry or the executive team to make decisions, because many of the teams knew within their envelope, as long as if they were able to grow faster, we would be willing to put more money behind them, and that was kind of an accepted alignment. So we were able to move a bit faster. Where we spent most of our time was like, oh, do we want to move investment between bets, between business units, if you will, and kind of those trade-offs. And that generally just came from like how much progress are we seeing against our specific milestones, and that's where we spend most of our time. But within a specific product area, we just let the teams move as fast as they could.
So you essentially set up triggers or thresholds as like go or no go.
That's right.
That takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. I like that tactic.
The analogy in how we've done this for a while now is look at every part of our business as a startup, meaning this is the seed. This is the seed business. This is the A business. This is the C. So the C
like
is
this.
much more
Yeah.
scaled. It's this is the type of gross margin we should see, profitability we should see. The seed is all about when you get product market fit. What are you going to do to get there? It's like, what are the milestones you're gonna hit? And just really, and given we serve the startup world, like that really resonates with all our employees. And so really using that as a way to kind of align on what specific product you're working on, where it is in its development stage, has been really helpful.
I like how you think about it as incubating different engines for growth, it sounds like, and almost making investment decisions as if you were like having a portfolio of products that you're funding. Because just to go back to what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, you have to have the right metrics to benchmark against the right stages. And I don't know, I never thought about it that way. Why wouldn't you want to do the same thing for your own product lines within the company?
And that's what we continue to do to this day. Like, and now we've learned like what are the metrics we really need to pay attention to? What's the right level of investment? Because in the early days, it's a lot of trial and error. Like it's really difficult to really figure out exactly how much you should invest. Now we've got enough. We've got years of experience in launching new things, and frankly, some have worked and they've worked great. Some have not, and we've had to kill them. And so it's also kind of that whole life cycle. How do you work through that, and how quickly can you get to an answer?
And so the ones that you do have to kill off, and you don't have to say product names or anything, but like it's hard to kill your babies if you put your heart and soul into the product. How do you deliver that message?
A lot of it is actually, again, with transparency. Like here's what we're seeing. Do you see something different? Right? Like here are the milestones that we had. We hit half of them. Like that doesn't scream product market fit. Like, are there things that we've missed? And one simple framework we use, and even to this day, I had a discussion about this just yesterday with many of our execs. Think of it as a matrix. Is it a good idea or bad idea? And good execution, bad execution, as a way to kind of break down why something is working versus not working. So for example, if one of your bets is not working, is it because it was just a bad idea? Like we thought this would be a great product for our customers. Turns out we were wrong. That's happened. Or we still think and we can support that it's a good idea because the feedback we're getting is good, or we have enough metrics in terms of usage that there is something, but we screwed up the execution. That happens too. And then why that's important is then that helps you understand what do you need to solve. If it's execution, that's solvable. If it's a bad idea, that's a lot more complicated. And just generally, bad idea means you're probably not going to continue to fund that.
I love this framework because it's kind of like, what can I control and what can I not control?
That's right. And it's still hard to tell people like, oh, we screwed up execution, which means like you didn't quite deliver. So that's never an easy message, but it helps try to have like a consistent framework across all these product areas.
And when you deliver those messages, I heard you ask a question. It was, are you seeing something that I'm not seeing? Do you find it best to actually ask questions rather than make statements in those scenarios?
Yes, that's another thing I've learned from our CEO Henry. He, before going into here's what I think, he'll ask a lot of questions. He's very curious and accepts that I may not be seeing everything. How about everybody else? Tell me, what are you seeing? What may I be missing in the picture, in the data? But on the flip side, once he feels like he's got a good picture, he's not afraid to make decisions and tell everybody here's what I'm thinking. But he's really good at starting with listening and asking questions.
I need to get better at asking questions because a lot of times I'll come at things from like a fact-based pattern. And what I'm realizing is if I use questions to get there, it delivers a certain level of empathy
100%.
and it helps people come to their own conclusion of why I'm maybe seeing it that way.
That's exactly right.
We talked about, funding products kind of almost as a VC portfolio. And one of your products that I'm super fascinated by is Carta X for the secondary market. Maybe if you could give some context on the product and hit on maybe a couple points on why you saw the need for that in the first place.
Yeah, of course. So what it is broadly think of it as a liquidity solutions for our customers, and by customers, I really include all the stakeholders that we serve. So think the companies and
You have a lot
the
of
management
customers.
team. We do. It's a good thing. What was interesting, this was part of Henry's vision from day one, but only became possible once we had enough of the stakeholders in the private markets together on our platform, meaning employees using Carta accounts, the companies managing the cap tables through Carta, and investors also having access to their portfolios through Carta. So just having everybody on one platform was really step number one to even be able to start working on this. And what it is just providing the infrastructure end to end to kind of structure either tender offers or block trades and going all the way to settlements. That's really kind of everything we've built. And think of it as the infrastructure that happens in the public markets. None of that exists in the private markets. How do we use the existing infrastructure we have all the way to moving money and shares around to settle to help the private markets to operate better there? And the need to solve this was by just observing that it was a very opaque market. Pricings are all over the place. There isn't any efficient ways to do this, meaning people spend a ton of time first to get a deal done. And then I'm always impressed how it takes them months to settle a transaction. It's
literally
crazy in the world. Yeah. And that's like in any CFO at this point of being through a tender or any other transaction knows how painful it is first to do.
And thankless. People always complain around how long things take.
Yes.
People get squirrely at the last moments. Like it's really not fun to be on the finance team during a secondary transaction.
It's not. You're right. There's a lot of like, well, this should be easy, but it isn't. And so it was really that realization that there's got to be an easier way for us to enable this. And so that's how we started working on this. And at this point, we can run pretty much any type of transaction. We even ran an auction on our own stock a couple of years back to try what that looks like. And so we have all that infrastructure. But really, it comes down to just the basics of like there's zero infrastructure to enable this. There should be. We think liquidity is an important tool in the private markets. We think it's here to stay. After the last few years, many companies have used liquidity as a way to attract and retain talent. The challenge with that for those companies is once you do it, it's tough to never do it again because not everybody understands what it means. And then broadly, like, we think and we see it from many of our customers, that's now become part of how they think about compensation broadly and retaining employees is being able to provide liquidity at certain intervals. Would it happen like every quarter? We're probably far away from that, but regular liquidity, I think, is going to be on everybody's mind as we continue to grow.
Let's dig into that. As an employee, so traditionally you can't sell your shares in private companies. If now you can, there are more opportunities. How does that impact how employees and/or companies, I guess, should think about total comp?
I think. And we're seeing this is like employees now take that into consideration when they choose companies, right? Like say the prospects of both private companies are similar. like you believe in what they're working on and in the future growth of each business, there's a clear difference between the company that will give you some opportunity for liquidity, say every 1 or 2 years, versus the company that says, you know what, no liquidity until we get acquired or there's an IPO. And especially in an environment where a good number of companies are providing liquidity. And after the 2020, 2022 period, a lot of companies provided liquidity. So that's just now an accepted fact that this is possible. And many employees will now ask, like, what everybody else is doing, why can't we get some liquidity? It's tricky, right? You also don't want people to sell like 80% of their stock, and now they have no incentive to continue to push and make the business really, really successful.
And I wanted to ask you about that. Like, what I'm a CFO running my first secondary tender. What guardrails, if you could pick maybe 2 or 3, would you encourage them to set up?
There's so many of them. Like, there's such a.
You can go over 2 or 3. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, because, and I say this because I personally spent time with many of our customers saying, hey, here's what we've done. Like, not saying this is like the best practice, but we've done over my tenure, we've done 6 liquidity events, which is probably on the high end compared to other companies. And so we've gone through many different iterations, many different structures. And so it's from a guardrail standpoint of like participation, it's really being thoughtful on, well, how do I make sure my employees continue to be incentivized? And so for us, we've set thresholds on how much of your vested shares can you sell. We actually make it different if you're on the executive team, meaning it's a lot lower than if you're an employee. Same thing with investors. We've allowed our investors to sell as well. Same thing. Like, how do we constrain their ability to sell? We don't want them to sell their whole stake, because that would likely disrupt the ability for employees to have access. So really thinking for one transaction, but also having a strategy on how do you think about liquidity broadly. It enables you to make decisions on what you're going to allow people to do in your first one or the first couple. So that's one. And that also impacts the structure of your transaction, meaning, well, who are the sellers? Is it just employees, ex-employees, investors? Who are the buyers? Because all of this, and this is where we see people kind of struggling to understand what the implications are. It has implications on your 401(k), has implications now on your stock-based comp, has implications on tax treatment. And all these things is where it actually, the rubber hits the road. And of course, you can never optimize for everything. So for example, if you want like the best tax treatment, you may not get the best 401(k) impact. And it's just like, and really working through all these components with folks who've done this many times is quite critical, especially if it's your first one. CFOs who've never done it, to really make sure they get a ton of advice on how to structure it properly.
So if I'm playing it back, you should constrain. Do you usually do by dollar or by percent that people can sell?
I've seen people do both, and we've also seen people get really, really detailed on based on tenure and everything. For us, it's always been a percent of vested shares, and different thresholds depending on how senior you are in the business.
So those are the 2 guardrails usually: your level in the company and the percent.
Those are the main ones for us.
Have you ever seen it go wrong
in terms of allowing people to have access to liquidity? I mean, invariably, right? Like we've had some of our early employees who've done well, right, over the years, and some of them, like, the challenge is you got to be okay with some of them now have enough to go start their own company. So we have many companies in our space now were started by ex-Carta employees who, thanks to liquidity, were like, this is great. I've got the risk is gone in terms of I can try this for a year, and I don't feel like I'm taking a huge risk because I've got some money put aside. That's the risk, but in our mind, that's the right thing to do. And frankly, we love just creating new founders. So that's, in the grand scheme of things, not a bad thing.
I'm a big boxing fan, and Marvin Hagler used to say it's really hard to wake up in the morning and run those 10 miles when you're sleeping in silk pajamas.
That's like it's such a hard balance, right?
So moving into what we like to call our long ass lightning round, I wanted to start off by asking you, could you give us an example of something you've ever messed up in your career on the job?
I think one of the worst things is I learned the hard way is not firing somebody fast enough. And why I say this is because I don't think I appreciated the impact it had on the broader team by keeping somebody who was not performing, clearly wasn't performing, who I liked personally, and being like too too attached to that, and being willing to see that the performance was lacking and how it impacted everybody else. That was probably one of the biggest mistakes I've done in this job, was to not take action fast enough. I'm a lot better at it now, but I had to learn the hard way.
It's funny you say that. We talked to Jenny Decker from Front, CFO at Front recently, and she said that I've made two bad decisions, hiring the wrong person and not letting that person go fast enough. And she said those are actually two different mistakes.
Can't agree more. I've made both of those as well. And so those are really critical ones to get better at, I think.
Roll the theme music, producer Nancy. And with that, it's time to rep yo stack, sponsored by Tropic, the next-gen procurement platform helping modern CFOs take control of their budgets and bottom line. By combining approval workflows, supplier management, and pricing benchmarks all in one place, Tropic makes savings opportunities easy to find and act on. Visit tropicapp.io to learn how. Can you walk me through what you're using for your finance tool stack today?
Ooh, let's see. We love implementing software. Try to automate as much as we can. We're a NetSuite shop.
We love NetSuite here. Sponsor the podcast.
NetSuite's a great system. We use Zora for some of our kind of subscription management and billing. We've been a long-time Pigment customer. I know they're pretty new to the US, but we've been using them for a while.
I spoke to Julian from Pigment recently. He said to say hello, so he's happy.
Great,
he's happy to have you as a customer.
We're big fans. Zip, we're big fans from a procurement standpoint. Flowcast, long-time users around kind of close automation. These are all the big ones that come to mind. But we're constantly looking at where can we, actually, discussion I have with my team all the time is like, before you add a person, are you sure that there's a piece of software that can help us do this faster and better?
What's the most recent tool you bought?
I think the most recent is probably Pigment, because we haven't changed a whole lot since then.
And those guys are on a tear. Okay. Last question for you here. What's the craziest thing you've ever had someone try to expense?
The one I remember, I think I've got a few really interesting dinners and things like this, but the funniest one maybe was we have a benefit at Carta where we allow people to expense books for their own use. Like, so we want to encourage everybody to read, mostly business books, but generally we're pretty, we're pretty broad. But the first year, I remember distinctly somebody put in an expense for like 30 books, and it was right around Christmas time. And I still remember it was like, they had the Harry Potter series, like 4 of them. So clearly it was like Christmas gifts.
They were getting children's books.
And they were like, hey, this is just for you. Like, this is not meant for you to kind of offer.
I'm a voracious reader.
Clearly. And you want the same series like several times because you like it so much. So yeah, that was one of the funniest I remember.
That's a good one. I hadn't heard that one before. Cool. Well, Charly, huge fan of Carta, huge fan of the career you've built, and I just want to really thank you for carving out time for us today.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Run the Numbers is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, Econ 102, and more. If you like the episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or rate us on Spotify. Do it.